There is a stretch of King Street West in Toronto, Ontario, where a parking structure and a stadium now stand on ground that once held the largest concentration of agricultural machinery production in Canada. Nothing about the asphalt suggests it. No plaque marks where the foundry floors ran. But for nearly a century, the company headquartered on this ground put implements bearing the name Massey into the hands of farmers from Saskatchewan to South Australia. The color those implements wore, a bright, unmistakable red with straw yellow wheels that caught the light against a green field, once told every neighbor driving past exactly which dealership a man trusted. The company that built that color no longer exists under its own name. It was folded, sold, renamed, and finally absorbed piece by piece into a business most of its original founders would not have recognized. This is the story of how that happened.
The story begins in 1847 in the small town of Newcastle, Ontario, on the north shore of Lake Ontario. Daniel Massey, a farmer who had spent the 1830s growing increasingly fascinated by labor-saving machinery, sold his farm to his eldest son and used the proceeds to buy into a struggling foundry. By 1849, he had moved the operation into a larger two-story brick building and renamed it the Newcastle Foundry and Machine Manufactory. The business made plows, harrows, cultivators, and rollers, the ordinary iron of a farming colony. But Daniel Massey had an eye for what was coming, and his foundry began producing some of the world's earliest mechanical threshers, machines that could separate grain from stalk and husk faster than any crew of men with flails. Daniel Massey died in 1856, and the company passed to his son, Hart Almarin Massey, who proved to be one of the most aggressive marketers in the history of Canadian industry. Hart renamed the firm the Massey Manufacturing Company, secured Canadian manufacturing rights to the latest American mower and reaper designs, and in 1879 moved the entire operation to Toronto, where it grew into one of the city's largest employers, a sprawling complex of factory buildings on King Street West that became for a time as recognizable a Toronto landmark as the harbor itself.
80 miles away in Brantford, Ontario, a rival was rising. Alanson Harris had founded his own implement business in 1857 in Beamsville, building Kirby mowers and reapers, and by the 1880s, his company's Brantford Binder was outselling nearly everything Massey had to offer. The two firms fought for the same farmers, the same dealerships, the same acres of Ontario wheat country, until 1891, when Hart Massey, having lost a technological race for the first time in his career, proposed a merger instead of continuing the fight. On the 6th of May, 1891, Massey Harris Company Limited was formally established. The combined company instantly became the largest agricultural equipment manufacturer in the British Empire, a title it would hold for decades, with dealerships eventually reaching into the United States, France, Germany, Australia, Italy, Spain, and the United Kingdom.
For its first decades, Massey Harris equipment wore no single signature shade. Early mowers carried deep forest green frames with straw yellow wheels, a scheme that lasted into the 1930s. But as the company finally moved seriously into tractor manufacturing, introducing its first true Massey Harris badged tractors in 1930, built initially on designs inherited from the Wallace Tractor Company, which Massey Harris had acquired along with the J.I. Case Plow Works of Racine, Wisconsin, the color identity sharpened. By the late 1930s, with the introduction of styled tractors like the Massey Harris Challenger and the streamlined Model 101 in 1938, the company had settled into the look that would define it for the rest of its history, a bright tractor red with straw yellow wheels and trim. A farmer driving past a yard with a Massey Harris parked in it knew it on sight, the same way he knew a green Oliver or a gray Ford. That red and yellow combination was Massey Harris's signature on the landscape, and it stayed that way through the company's most productive years. If Massey Harris has one machine that represents its peak, its single greatest contribution to the history of farming, it is not a tractor at all. It is the number 21 self-propelled combine harvester, introduced in 1941, the direct descendant of the heavier and more expensive number 20 that Massey engineer Tom Carroll had developed in 1938. The number 21 was the first commercially successful self-propelled combine in the world, a machine that did not need to be towed behind a tractor, but carried its own engine, its own drive, its own header, a single operator doing the work that had once taken a threshing crew of 12 men and several days. The significance of that machine became unmistakable during the Second World War, when Massey Harris organized what came to be called the Harvest Brigade. With farm labor scarce across North America because so many men had gone to war, Massey Harris convinced roughly 500 custom harvesting crews to take its self-propelled combines on a coordinated march northward through the wheat belt, starting in Texas in the spring and working up through Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, and into Canada as the harvest ripened with the season, covering many times the acreage that older equipment and shrinking labor pools could otherwise have managed. It was, in effect, a fleet of mobile harvesting units solving a wartime food crisis, and it cemented the Massey Harris name in the memory of an entire generation of grain farmers. The company's tractor line of the period, the post-war MH22, MH33, MH44, and MH55 series, ranging from roughly 25 to 55 horsepower, and the later triple series of the mid-1950s, rode that same wave of post-war prosperity. These were the tractors that put red and yellow paint on tens of thousands of North American farms. What happened next was the decision that would define the rest of the company's existence, and it came not from financial collapse, but from ambition. In 1953, Massey Harris purchased the Ferguson Company, the business built by Northern Irish inventor Harry Ferguson, whose three-point hitch system had already revolutionized how implements attached to tractors. The combined firm was renamed Massey Harris Ferguson Limited. Harry Ferguson himself was reportedly unhappy with how the merger was structured and left the new company within a year. The cumbersome triple name did not last either. In 1957 and 1958, the company shortened itself to simply Massey Ferguson. The Massey Harris name, carried for 67 years and built on the work of two founding families, was quietly retired from the masthead. The tractors of the merger era, the Massey Harris 50, based on Ferguson's own TO-35 design, were, fittingly, the very last machines to carry the old name at all.
By this point, control had already passed well outside the founding family. As far back as 1927, an unsolicited American takeover bid had forced a sale of Massey stock to Toronto financiers Thomas Bradshaw and J.H. Gundy, keeping the company in Canadian hands but ending direct Massey family control of day-to-day operations. The descendants went on to other things. Vincent Massey became Governor General of Canada, and Raymond Massey became a Hollywood actor, but none of them were running the tractor business anymore. The company that bore their name was now a public, professionally managed multinational, and like most companies of that shape, it would eventually be steered by men who had never walked a Massey Harris field at harvest.
Massey Ferguson entered the 1980s already carrying enormous debt from decades of global expansion. Factories and operations spread across Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and beyond. Then the farm economy itself buckled. Between 1981 and 1986, the American farm crisis tore through the Corn Belt. Commodity prices collapsed, land values that had climbed through the 1970s fell sharply, and interest rates that had peaked above 20% left heavily leveraged farms and dealerships unable to service their debt. Hundreds of thousands of American farms went under or were forced to consolidate over the course of the decade. Equipment dealers watched their order books empty out almost overnight because a farmer who could not service his land loan was not buying a new combine.
Massey Ferguson, already overextended, came close to collapse multiple times through the late 1970s and into the 1980s. The Canadian and Ontario governments stepped in more than once with financial support to keep the company alive, restructuring its debt and its operations repeatedly. The company shed divisions, closed plants, and shrank its global footprint in a desperate effort to survive a decade that was hostile to every farm equipment maker, but hardest of all on the ones already weakened by debt.
There is a detail in the corporate record that surprises people who assume Massey Ferguson simply vanished in the farm crisis. It did not then.
The company survived the 1980s, badly wounded, and limped into the 1990s still building tractors. But in 1986, in an effort to put the troubled history behind it, the parent company changed its name to Verity Corporation. The brand on the tractors stayed Massey Ferguson, but the company that owned it no longer carried any Massey name at all. The final dissolution came in two bites. In 1993, Agco Corporation, based in Duluth, Georgia, purchased the marketing and distribution operations of Massey Ferguson Farm Equipment from Verity. In 1994, Agco completed the acquisition by purchasing the remainder of the Massey Ferguson division outright. A Canadian company, founded by a Canadian blacksmith's son in a foundry on the shore of Lake Ontario, expanded by Canadian financiers into the largest agricultural machine maker in the British Empire, was now, in full, the property of an American conglomerate based in the American South. The Massey Harris name had effectively been gone since 1958. Now the company itself, under any name, was gone too. Agco continues to manufacture tractors under the Massey Ferguson brand today, but it is a brand inside a portfolio, not a company with its own history walking the floor. The King Street West Works in Toronto, the buildings that had once made Massey Harris one of the city's largest employers, were sold off in stages through the 20th century. The site is now occupied in part by what became the Exhibition Place grounds and surrounding development, with little on the ground today to mark what the buildings once held. Racine, Wisconsin, the city where Massey Harris's acquired Case Plowworks operations once built Wallace-derived tractors, saw its own long industrial decline as farm equipment manufacturing consolidated across the region through the second half of the century, part of a broader contraction in Midwestern farm implement manufacturing towns that hit Racine, Charles City, West Allis, and a dozen other communities at roughly the same time. Brantford, Ontario, once home to the Harris side of the company and its famous binder works, has spent decades reinventing its old industrial core. None of these towns disappeared, but the work that once filled their factory floors with the specific clang of Massey Harris production did. Before the towns and the closures, there was the machine, the one piece of iron that, more than any other, is the reason this story is worth telling at all. If Massey Harris has a single tractor that represents the company at its absolute peak of confidence, it is the styled Model 101, introduced in 1938. The 101 was, by the standards of its decade, startlingly modern. A streamlined hood line, louvered side curtains over the engine bay, chrome trim where most competitors still offered bare sheet metal, and that bright Massey Harris red with straw yellow wheels set against it like a signature on a check. It did not look like a machine built to survive a depression. It looked like a machine built by a company that believed the worst was already behind it. Underneath the styling, the 101 told a more complicated story, one this audience would recognize instantly. It was reworked across its production run with 3 different engines, 2 supplied by Chrysler and 1 by Continental, and the model name shifted slightly each time, from 101 to 101 Super to 101 Senior, while the rest of the tractor stayed mechanically the same machine underneath. That is not the tidy biography of a single perfect design. It is the real biography of a company stretching a good idea as far as engineering and supply chains would let it go, which is exactly what every farm equipment maker was doing in the years coming out of the Depression. The 101 rode on the twin power principle the company had already proven on the Challenger and Pacemaker lines, a control that let the engine spin faster for belt work than it needed to for pulling a plow, squeezing extra horsepower out of the same iron when the job called for it. Today, restored examples of the Model 101 and its 101 Super and Senior variants are among the more recognizable fixtures of the antique tractor show circuit, instantly identifiable, even to people who could not tell a Farmall from an Oliver at 50 paces, because that red and yellow streamlined hood was built, deliberately, to be unforgettable. It was the tractor that made Massey Harris look like the future. It would be another decade and a half before the merger with Ferguson made the name itself a memory. The King Street West Works in Toronto, the buildings that had once made Massey Harris one of the city's largest employers, were sold off in stages through the 20th century.
The site is now occupied in part by what became the Exhibition Place grounds and surrounding development, with little on the ground today to mark what the buildings once held. Where a visitor today might walk past a stadium gate or a parking structure without a second thought, there was once a working complex large enough that its smokestacks were a recognizable part of the Toronto skyline, a place where a man could walk in as a teenager and retire 40 years later, having never worked anywhere else.
Racine, Wisconsin, the city where Massey Harris's acquired Case Plowworks operations once built Wallace-derived tractors before they were rebadged under the Massey name, saw its own long industrial decline as farm equipment manufacturing consolidated across the region through the second half of the century, part of a broader contraction in Midwestern farm implement manufacturing towns that hit Racine, Charles City, West Allis, and a dozen other communities at roughly the same time. These were not towns built around one factory, the way a single industry mining town is built around one mine. They were towns where 2 or 3 competing implement makers often sat within a short drive of each other, trading skilled labor back and forth, so that when one plant's order books emptied out, the ripple went through every dealership, every supplier, every diner near the gate that had fed 3 shifts of machinists for half a century. Brantford, Ontario, once home to the Harris side of the company, the Binder Works, where Alanson Harris's open-end design had briefly out-engineered Hart Massey himself and forced the 1891 merger in the first place, has spent decades reinventing its old industrial core, the way so many mid-sized manufacturing cities across Ontario and the American Midwest have had to. None of these towns disappeared outright. People still live in Toronto, in Racine, in Brantford. Children still go to school 3 streets over from where a Massey Harris foundry or binder works once stood. But the specific rhythm of that work, the shift whistle, the rail spur loaded with finished implements, the dealer's truck idling at the loading dock waiting for a shipment of red and yellow steel, went quiet in each of these places, town by town, decade by decade, long before most people now living there were born. Unlike almost any other vanished industrial brand, agricultural equipment carries forward through an unusually active and visible community of people who simply refuse to let the machines stop running. The Massey Collectors Association maintains paint codes, part sources, and restoration records for Wallace, Massey Harris, Massey Ferguson, and Ferguson equipment, specifically so the next generation of restorers can match the original red and straw yellow correctly. In Canada, the Massey Harris Ferguson Collectors Club gathers members around exactly this brand's history, and farm publications across North America still regularly run features from families who grew up on Massey Harris tractors, sons and granddaughters who learned to drive a Model 101 or a 44 Series tractor on the same farm where their grandfather bought it new, and who now bring those same machines out for antique tractor shows and state fair demonstrations every summer. Somewhere this season, in a machine shed in rural Manitoba or southwestern Ontario or the wheat country of Kansas, someone is timing the magneto on a Massey Harris pacemaker or polishing the straw yellow wheels of a 44 Series ahead of a county fair parade. The knowledge of how that engine breathes, how that transmission shifts, how that red paint is supposed to look against an October field, none of that lives in a corporate archive anymore. It lives in people, and in machines old enough to have outlasted the company that built them. The red and yellow of a Massey Harris tractor did not disappear from North American farmland because the paint faded. It disappeared because the company that made it kept getting smaller, kept getting renamed, kept getting sold, first into a merger that erased its name in 1958, then into a holding company that erased its own name in 1986, then into a foreign-owned conglomerate that erased what remained of its independence in 1994. Each step looked, at the time, like a survival strategy. Looked at together, across more than a century, they are the slow disassembly of a company that had once been, by every measure that mattered to a 19th century Canadian farmer, the biggest name in the business the British Empire had to offer. That is the real story here. Not a single dramatic collapse, but a long erosion, decade by decade, of a name that a foundry owner in Newcastle, Ontario, built with his own hands in 1847. The tractors are still out there. The color still exists in restored paint and county fair lineups. The company that gave that color its meaning does not. If your family ran a Massey Harris, or if your grandfather did, and you still remember the sound of it, the next story in this series is one you'll want to hear.